Loving these new Sherlock Holmes cases? Help us keep the mysteries coming by joining our Patreon. You will unlock early access to most of our stories before they hit YouTube. We rely on your financial support to produce these videos, so any contribution makes a huge difference. The link to our Patreon is in the description below. A French conundrum. It was a bright, unseasonably warm morning in late May, the sort of day that coaxed the burgeoning leaves of London into full, verdant display and made the air heavy with the promise of approaching summer. I was comfortably ensconced in my armchair by the open window overlooking Baker Street, engaged in a desultory perusal of the day's Pall Mall Gazette, when the sudden sharp clang of the front door knocker roused me from my reverie. My immediate thought was of some new imbroglio, a fresh victim of human perfidy seeking the singular counsel of my friend, Mr. Sherlock Holmes. Indeed, in our lodgings at 221B, such interruptions were as regular as the chiming of the church bells, often heralded by the dramatic entry of some agitated soul or the enigmatic arrival of a telegram. On this particular occasion, however, it was the latter. Our landlady, the redoubtable Mrs. Hudson, entered shortly after, bearing a yellow envelope upon her tray. Holmes, who had been bent over his chemical apparatus in a corner of the room, his long, bony fingers manipulating a retort with the delicate precision of a surgeon, straightened up with a sigh of distinct anticipation. He plucked the telegram from the tray, his keen grey eyes scanning the brevity of its contents, and a faint, almost imperceptible smile played upon his thin lips. "A summons, Watson," he declared, tossing the flimsy paper across the room to me, "and from a rather unusual quarter." I caught it deftly and unfolded it, my gaze falling upon the neatly typed message. "Your expert aid urgently required. Madame Montpensier affair, Prefect Dubonnet, Paris." I confess my brow furrowed in immediate perplexity. Paris, Holmes, and a prefect. This is quite out of the common rut, even for you. A foreign jurisdiction, a French case. "Precisely, my dear fellow," Holmes interjected, turning from his chemicals and wiping his hands on a cloth with a methodical air. A refreshing change from the parochial crimes of our own metropolis. The French police, for all their systematic logic and meticulous adherence to procedure, occasionally find themselves stumped by a certain je ne sais quoi. Dubonnet, as I recall, is a man of considerable sagacity within his own sphere, although even the keenest of minds can be blinkered by habit. "But who is this Madame Montpensier?" I pressed, already envisioning the complexities of a French aristocratic scandal. "And what is the nature of this affair?" Holmes moved to the mantelpiece, where his pipe and tobacco pouch lay. "Ah, the name. Yes, I believe I may have mentioned it to you before, perhaps in passing. A noblewoman accused, if the prefect's urgency is any guide, of a grave crime. The particulars, alas, are yet to be revealed. The implication, my dear Watson, is that she is suspected of poisoning her husband, the Marquis de Montpensier. A delicate situation indeed, and one ripe for misinterpretation." "Poisoning!" I exclaimed, the word carrying its own dread weight. "Good heavens, Holmes! This sounds like a capital offence, even in France. What could possibly lead the prefect to seek your assistance?" "My reputation, I suppose," he said with an almost uncharacteristic shrug, a faint cloud pipe smoke now curling about his head. and perhaps a modicum of desperation. The French legal system, for all its vaunted rationality, is quite capable of condemning an innocent party with admirable efficiency if the weight of circumstantial evidence becomes too great. They value logical coherence above all else, frequently to the exclusion of the genuinely unexpected. My role, I surmise, will be to introduce that very element of the unexpected. He consulted his pocket watch. There is a train from Charing Cross at 2 o'clock. Sufficient time for a light luncheon and to arrange our affairs. Pack a small valise, Watson, and remember your revolver. Paris, for all its springtime gaiety, is still a city where shadows can conceal unpleasantness, though I doubt it shall be required for this particular investigation. Our weapons shall be intellect and observation, as always. And so it was that within a few hours we found ourselves rattling across the Kentish countryside, the familiar English landscape gradually giving way to the sparkling blue waters of the Channel, and then, after a remarkably uneventful crossing, to the flat fields and picturesque villages of France. I had always enjoyed these excursions with Holmes, as they offered the thrill of the chase alongside a unique perspective into the workings of his extraordinary mind. To observe him in a foreign setting, untethered from the usual resources of Scotland Yard, was to witness his brilliance in its purest form. Paris, when we arrived, was a spectacle of bustling streets, elegant boulevards bathed in the golden afternoon light, and the unmistakable aroma of coffee and cigars. We took a cab directly to the Préfecture de Police, a grand, imposing edifice that spoke of authority and the methodical pursuit of justice. Prefect Dubonnet was a man of medium height and solid build, with a neatly trimmed grey beard and eyes that, though weary, held a spark of keen intelligence. He greeted Holmes with a deference that bordered on reverence, his French rapid and precise, though mercifully interspersed with sufficient English for my comprehension. "Monsieur Holmes, Dr. Watson, bienvenue à Paris," he declared, shaking our hands with a firm grip. "I confess I felt a certain temerity in summoning you across the Channel. However, the urgency of this matter is paramount. Our own resources, I fear, have reached an impasse." "The case of Madame Montpensier, I presume, Prefect?" Holmes inquired, his gaze already taking in the minutiae of the Prefect's office, from the neatly stacked documents to the faint aroma of tobacco that clung to the air. "Precisely so. A most lamentable affair. The Marquis de Montpensier, a man of considerable standing, was found dead in his chateau some 3 days ago. The cause, beyond a shadow of a doubt, was poison, specifically arsenic, or so our preliminary analyses indicate." The Prefect paused, sighing deeply. "And all evidence, however regrettable, points to his wife, the Marquise Irene de Montpensier." "The evidence, Prefect?" Holmes prompted, settling into a chair, his expression unreadable. "Alas, a grim collection of circumstances," Dubonnet began, consulting a dossier. "The Marquis, a man of robust health for his 58 years, was discovered by his valet, Monsieur Dubois, having collapsed in his private study. He had complained of severe abdominal pains, vomiting, and a burning sensation shortly after partaking of his evening meal. The local physician, Dr. Moreau, was summoned, yet the Marquis expired within the hour. Subsequent examination and analysis by our own forensic chemists confirm the presence of a potent poison. Now for the motive. The marriage, Monsieur Holmes, was profoundly unhappy, The Marquis was a stern, even tyrannical man, known for his philandering and his harsh treatment of his wife. Madame Montpensier, a woman of refinement and sensitivity, had endured much. There had been recent public arguments. Furthermore, a massive inheritance passes to her upon his death. Thirdly, and perhaps most damningly, a small phial containing a white powder, later confirmed to be arsenic, was discovered among Madame Montpensier's personal effects, secreted rather clumsily in a small jewellery box in her boudoir. She claims it was planted there, asserting she knows nothing of it. Who else could have placed it there? A powerful circumstantial case, indeed, Holmes murmured, a glint appearing in his eye. And Madame Montpensier herself? What is her demeanour? Distraught, naturally, the prefect replied. She remains steadfast in her denial. She maintains her innocence with an almost desperate vehemence, insisting she adored her husband despite their difficulties. There are, alas, no other suspects, no signs of forced entry, no alternative logical explanation. The household was closed, entirely dependent on trusted staff. The chef, an old retainer, is beyond reproach. The valet, Dubois, equally so. The Château de Bellechasse, is a secluded estate some 2 hours south of Paris. It seems an open and shut case, monsieur, yet there is something about the Marquise's conviction that gives me pause. Call it an intuition, a feeling that perhaps the obvious explanation is completely wrong. And that, Monsieur Holmes, is why you are here. Holmes nodded slowly, his fingers already drumming a light tattoo on the arm of his chair. Intuition, Prefect, is often merely unconscious deduction. I shall endeavour to give it form. Tell me, what was the Marquise's last meal? And were there any particular delicacies of which he was fond? Ah, yes, the meal. Dubonnet consulted his notes again. A fairly standard late spring dinner. Consommé, a roasted pheasant, some accompanying spring vegetables, and a simple fruit tart for dessert. Nothing unusual, according to the chef. The Marquis, however, was known for his singular appetites. He had a particular passion for summer truffles. It is the beginning of the tuber estivum season, you understand, and he had recently acquired a fresh supply, highly prized. He insisted they be served liberally with every suitable dish. Truffles, Holmes repeated, the word hanging in the air. An interesting detail, Prefect. A most interesting detail indeed. A spark of excitement, rarely seen, flickered in his eyes. We shall need to proceed to Château de Bellechasse without delay. Bellechasse and the scent of truffles. The journey to Château de Bellechasse was undertaken in a motor car provided by the Prefecture, a relatively new marvel of engineering that clattered and roared through the French countryside. Watson, ever the observer, found himself distracted by the rolling hills and picturesque vineyards, a stark contrast to the grim purpose of our expedition. Holmes remained completely absorbed in his own thoughts. His gaze was fixed on the passing scenery, though his mind was entirely occupied by the intricate web of circumstances that had brought us there. Château de Bellechasse was an ancient edifice, a sprawling pile of grey stone steeped in centuries of history. Turrets pierced the sky, and ivy clung tenaciously to its venerable walls. It possessed an air of faded grandeur, hinting at past glories now touched by the chill of neglect. A long tree-lined avenue led to the main entrance, where a uniformed gendarme stood sentinel, a testament to the tragedy that had recently unfolded within. We were met by Inspector Renaud, a young, earnest officer whose face bore the marks of meticulous, yet ultimately fruitless, investigation. "Welcome to Bellechasse, Monsieur Holmes," Renaud offered, clearly impressed by the arrival of the legendary English detective. "We have preserved the scene as best as possible, though the initial examinations were, naturally, conducted before your summons." "Quite so, Inspector," Holmes replied, already taking in the facade of the chateau, his head tilted slightly, as if listening to its silent stories. "Let us begin where the tragedy struck. The Marquis's study, I believe?" The study was a cavernous room, panelled in dark oak, with heavy tapestries depicting ancient hunting scenes. A large desk dominated one end, littered with papers. It was here, by a massive fireplace, that the Marquis de Montpensier had taken his last breath. The faint outline on the carpet where his body had lain was a ghostly reminder of the event. "He was found here by Dubois, the valet," explained Prefect Dubonnet, gesturing to the spot. "He had spent the evening alone after dinner, as was his custom. Madame Montpensier retired early, complaining of a headache." Holmes moved with his characteristic economy of motion, his eyes darting about the room. He examined the armchair where the Marquis had likely been seated, the unlit grate, the books on the shelves, the ornate snuff-box on the mantelpiece. He picked up a half-smoked cigar from an ashtray, sniffed it, and replaced it. He paid particular attention to the small, intricately carved side table next to the armchair, where a decanter of brandy and a half-empty glass still stood. He sniffed the glass, then the decanter, his brow furrowing slightly. "Did the Marquis consume anything else in here, apart from this brandy, after his dinner?" Holmes asked, his voice low. "Nothing to our knowledge, monsieur," Inspector Renaud answered. "He dined, then retired here. Nothing was brought to him." Holmes walked slowly around the room, his gaze sweeping over the polished floor, the edges of the rug, the very air itself, as if searching for an invisible clue. He paused by the window, peering out into the lush, overgrown gardens, then turned his attention to the dining room which adjoined the study. The dining room was equally grand, with a long polished table set for two, though only one place setting had clearly been used. The remnants of the Marquis's last meal had been cleared. Holmes's attention was immediately drawn to the table linen. "Remarkable," he murmured, running a finger over a barely perceptible stain on the pristine white tablecloth. A faint discoloration here, near where the Marquis would have sat, and another, almost microscopic, on the edge of this plate. He pulled a magnifying glass from his waistcoat pocket and examined the spots with intense concentration. "Indicates a spill, perhaps, or a residue." Prefect Dubonnet and Inspector Renaud exchanged glances, clearly baffled by Holmes's focus on such trivialities. "We did note the table had been cleared, monsieur," Renaud offered, leaving no obvious signs of struggle or anything untoward. "Just the remains of a meal." "Indeed," Holmes replied, straightening up. "And what of the menu, Prefect? The specific dishes served?" "The chef, a Monsieur Antoine Dubois, no relation to the valet, I assure you, has provided a full account. Consommé de volaille, followed by a roasted pheasant stuffed with spring herbs, accompanied by braised endives and potato dauphinoise. For dessert, a simple tarte tatin, and, of course, the truffles." "The truffles," Holmes repeated, his eyes alight. "Tell me more of these truffles. Were they served with every course?" "Almost," Dubonnet confirmed. "The Marquis was exceedingly fond of them. These summer truffles were shaved over the consommé, finely diced and mixed with the stuffing of the pheasant, and even a small amount grated over the endives, a veritable truffle feast." "And the source of these truffles?" Holmes pressed. "Were they fresh, from a local market, or a specific purveyor?" "A local truffle hunter, Monsieur Legendre, provides them directly to the chateau each May," Renaud explained. "He is well regarded. The truffles were delivered only the day before the Marquise's death, exceedingly fresh." "And where were they stored?" Holmes asked, his gaze sweeping towards the adjacent kitchen. "After delivery and between preparation?" "In the cold larder, monsieur," Dubonnet replied. "A traditional storage area, kept cool and dark. Monsieur Antoine prides himself on the preservation of his ingredients." Holmes's next move was decisive. "Then the kitchen, gentlemen, and specifically this cold larder. That is where we shall proceed." The kitchen was a vast, bustling domain, even in the subdued atmosphere of the chateau's bereavement. Pots and pans hung from racks, and a huge cast-iron stove dominated one wall. Monsieur Antoine, a stout, florid-faced man with a drooping moustache, was summoned. He was clearly a man whose life revolved around culinary perfection, and he spoke of the Marquise's last meal with a mixture of pride and profound regret. Holmes cut straight to the heart of the matter. "Monsieur Antoine, the truffles. You received them the day before the Marquis's death?" "Yes, monsieur," the chef confirmed, his voice thick with a French accent. "From Legendre. Beautiful specimens of tuber estivum, large and fragrant. The finest of the early season." "And how were they stored?" "In the larder, monsieur," Antoine explained, leading us through a heavy wooden door into a remarkably cool, stone-lined room. "Here, I keep them in a special wooden box nestled in rice to preserve their moisture and aroma. The larder itself, you see, is very old. It is lined with lead, a traditional method for keeping things cool before modern refrigeration was common. The lead helps maintain a constant, low temperature." My blood ran cold at the mention of lead. I exchanged a quick, involuntary glance with Holmes, whose eyes remained fixed on the interior of the larder. It was indeed an ancient structure, shelves lining its walls, all encased in sheets of dull, greyish metal. The air within was distinctly damp, carrying a heavy, earthy smell. Holmes bent down, his keen gaze scrutinizing the floor of the larder, then ran his gloved fingers along the base of one of the lead-lined shelves. He withdrew his hand, examining his fingertip carefully. "And this wooden box, Monsieur Antoine? Where was it placed within this larder?" "On the lowest shelf, monsieur." The chef pointed to a spot near the floor. "As it is the coolest. The truffles are delicate." Holmes knelt, his face just inches from the lead lining on the lowest shelf. He produced his magnifying glass again. "Prefect, Inspector," he said, his voice unusually grave. "Observe this closely." We crowded around him, where the lead lining met the stone floor, and particularly in the corner where the chef indicated the truffle box had rested. There were distinct signs of extreme corrosion. A whitish, powdery residue clung to the lead, and in several places small flakes of the metal had completely crumbled away. It was subtle, easily missed by an untrained eye, yet undeniable once pointed out. "This is lead carbonate, gentlemen," Holmes stated, his tone matter of fact. "A common product of lead corrosion, especially in a perpetually damp environment. The conditions here, the high moisture, the interaction with organic matter, ideal for its rapid formation." I felt a sudden jolt of understanding, a flash of insight into the direction Holmes's thoughts were taking. Lead poisoning. The symptoms of lead poisoning, particularly acute exposure, could perfectly mimic those of arsenic, especially to an unspecialized observer. "And these truffles, Monsieur Antoine," Holmes continued, turning back to the chef, "were they washed thoroughly before being prepared?" "Hardly at all, monsieur," Antoine admitted, a touch of defensiveness in his voice. "Truffles are cleaned with a stiff brush, you see, to remove the soil. A thorough washing would ruin their delicate aroma. One tries to preserve the essence." "Indeed," Holmes said, a knowing look in his eye. "And the rice in which they were stored. Do you still have some of it?" Antoine, bewildered, nodded and produced a small quantity of the rice, now slightly discoloured and bearing the strong musky scent of truffles. Holmes took a sample, placing it carefully into a small evidence bag. He then scraped some of the powdery residue from the lead lining into another. "Prefect, I believe we have made a monumental discovery," Holmes announced, straightening up. "The true culprit lies here, in the heart of this ancient larder, and in the Marquis's unfortunate predilection for fungi. The silent assassin." Back in the prefect's office, the atmosphere had shifted palpably. The initial skepticism that had coloured the French officials' attitudes towards Holmes's esoteric deductions had been replaced by a growing unease, bordering on apprehension. The revelation of the corroded lead lining and Holmes's quiet pronouncement had introduced a disquieting new possibility, one that threatened to unravel their painstakingly constructed case. "Lead poisoning, Monsieur Holmes?" Prefect Dubonnet repeated, stroking his beard thoughtfully. "It is true, the symptoms, abdominal pain, vomiting, could be mistaken for arsenic. How could one mistake it so entirely? And the phial of arsenic found in the Marquise's possession. A most convenient discovery for the prosecution, Prefect," Holmes countered, leaning forward in his chair. "Almost too convenient, as we shall soon see. Let us first establish the medical facts. Dr. Watson, perhaps you could briefly outline the physiological effects of lead poisoning, particularly in its acute form." I cleared my throat, grateful for the opportunity to contribute my own expertise. "Certainly, Holmes. Chronic lead poisoning, or plumism, manifests with a wide array of symptoms: anemia, colic, constipation, headaches, and neurological impairments. An acute ingestion or a sudden massive increase in an already existing burden can be far more dramatic. The severe abdominal pain, nausea, and vomiting that the Marquis experienced are entirely consistent with an acute lead intoxication. The burning sensation he reported might have been due to the severe irritation of the digestive tract. It can easily be confused with arsenic, especially without specific chemical tests for lead." "Precisely," Holmes affirmed, turning back to the prefect. "The Marquis consumed a massive quantity of truffles, heavily infused with a foreign substance. He was a man, by all accounts, of robust constitution. Such a man might accumulate a considerable toxic load over time, remaining entirely asymptomatic until a critical dose tips the balance, resulting in a sudden, dramatic collapse." The truffles, steeped in lead-infused moisture over a period of 36 hours, acted as the perfect unsuspecting vehicle for the poison. How could the truffles absorb so much lead? Inspector Renault interjected, still struggling with the concept. They are fungi, hardly absorbent sponges. Indeed, Inspector, they are fungi, and certain fungi are uniquely adapted to absorb heavy metals and minerals from their environment, Holmes explained patiently. Consider the conditions in that ancient larder. Damp, cool, dark. The lead lining, exposed to the ambient moisture, slowly corroding, forming highly soluble lead carbonates. These compounds, suspended in the condensation, were greedily absorbed by the highly permeable tuber aestivum, particularly since they rested in direct contact with the moisture pooling on the lead-lined shelf. The rice, too, absorbed a significant quantity. The truffles became miniature reservoirs of the toxin, delivering it in concentrated doses during the Marquis's meal. He produced the 2 small bags containing the rice and the lead residue. I have arranged for access to a small laboratory here at the Prefecture. With your permission, Prefect, I shall perform a preliminary analysis on these samples. We will test for the presence of lead. Simultaneously, I strongly recommend that the Marquis's remains be re-examined specifically for lead content, and that the original forensic samples be reanalyzed for both arsenic and lead. Prefect Dubonnet, a man of scientific bent despite his bureaucratic position, nodded slowly. This is a most audacious theory, Monsieur Holmes. If you can provide the empirical proof, by all means proceed. Inspector Renault, ensure Monsieur Holmes has everything he requires for his analysis. The laboratory was a Spartan affair, and Holmes, with his usual resourcefulness, quickly made it his own. I watched, fascinated, as he set about his work with the precision and intensity that banished all fatigue. He crushed the rice, dissolving it in appropriate reagents, and performed delicate chemical tests, precipitating the lead salts, observing the characteristic colour changes. He repeated the process with the scrapings from the larder. Within a few hours, the evidence was undeniable. The distinctive yellow precipitate, indicative of lead chromate, formed brilliantly in both samples. Holmes presented his findings to the Prefect and Inspector Renault. "There you have it, gentlemen," he declared, holding up a small test tube containing the telltale precipitate. "Lead, present in massive quantities in both the rice that surrounded the truffles and the corroded lining of the larder. It is an absolute certainty that the truffles absorbed these lethal lead compounds." The Prefect stared at the test tube as if it contained the very essence of human folly. "This is profound, Monsieur Holmes. If what you say is true, Madame Montpensier is innocent of the poisoning. What then of the arsenic in her jewellery box?" "That, Prefect, is the final thread to pull," Holmes mused, cleaning his apparatus with meticulous care. "My immediate concern is the exoneration of an innocent woman. I propose we gather all involved parties tomorrow morning, Madame Montpensier, her lawyer, the valet Dubois, and Monsieur Antoine the chef, and present our findings. I have little doubt that the reanalysis of the Marquis's tissues will confirm my hypothesis." The revelation. The following morning, the Grand Salon of Château de Bellechasse was the setting for a most extraordinary assembly. The heavy velvet curtains were drawn back, allowing the bright spring sunlight to flood into the room. Prefect Dubonnet sat at the head of a long polished table, his expression grave. Beside him sat Inspector Renaud, looking a mixture of anticipation and professional awe. Holmes and I occupied 2 chairs opposite, my friend radiating his usual air of detached authority. Facing us were Madame Montpensier, her face pale and drawn, but her eyes holding a flicker of renewed hope, accompanied by her formidable lawyer, Maître Dubois, a man whose legal acumen was as sharp as his perfectly tailored suit. Also present were Monsieur Dubois, the valet, a slender, intensely nervous man whose eyes darted around the room, and Monsieur Antoine, the chef, whose usual culinary ebullience had been replaced by a quiet dread. Prefect Dubonnet cleared his throat. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have reconvened this morning following certain new developments in the regrettable case of the Marquis de Montpensier. Monsieur Holmes, whom we have had the honour of consulting, has brought forth a theory that requires our most serious consideration. Monsieur Holmes, if you please." Holmes rose, his tall, lean figure casting a long shadow across the polished floor. He surveyed the assembled company with his customary piercing gaze, his voice calm and measured. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "the death of the Marquis de Montpensier has, until recently, been attributed to poisoning by arsenic, with all evidence pointing directly to Madame Montpensier. My investigation, prompted by certain inconsistencies and a fresh perspective, has revealed a different and far more tragic explanation." He paused, allowing his words to sink in. Madame Montpensier gripped the arms of her chair, her gaze fixed on Holmes. "The initial assessment, while understandable, was entirely incorrect. The Marquis did not die from arsenic poisoning. He died from acute lead poisoning." A ripple of murmurs went through the room. Maître Dubois frowned, clearly preparing to object, while Holmes continued, holding up a hand. "Before you voice your understandable incredulity, Maître, allow me to present the irrefutable facts. We have confirmed the presence of lethal levels of lead in samples taken from the very larder where the Marquise's beloved spring truffles were stored." He recounted his findings from the cold larder with meticulous detail, describing the corroded lead lining, the damp conditions, and the scientific certainty with which the truffles absorbed the heavy metal from their environment. "Monsieur Antoine?" Holmes addressed the chef directly, his tone devoid of accusation. "You informed us that the truffles were stored on the lowest shelf of the larder, nestled in rice, and that they were deliberately left unwashed to preserve their aroma. Is this correct?" Monsieur Antoine, pale and trembling, nodded mutely. "Oui, monsieur. It is so. It is the way I have always done it." "And the Marquis, by all accounts, consumed them in extraordinary quantities with his last meal," Holmes continued. "He was unknowingly ingesting a potent, fatal dose of lead with every bite. The re-examination of the Marquise's tissues, requested by Prefect Dubonnet and conducted overnight, has unequivocally confirmed the presence of abnormally high levels of lead in his system, entirely consistent with a fatal dose. The original samples, when reanalyzed specifically for lead, tested overwhelmingly positive, proving the initial chemical test was tragically misled by similar symptomology." A gasp escaped Madame Montpensier's lips. Her lawyer, Maître Dubois, looked utterly stunned, the carefully constructed edifice of his defence crumbling into dust, replaced instantly by the sweet scent of total vindication. "Therefore," Holmes concluded, his voice ringing with quiet authority, The death of the Marquis de Montpensier was a profound tragedy, a bizarre accident of circumstance, and an unfortunate confluence of his particular tastes with an archaic method of food preservation. There was no foul play, no malice, no poison administered by human hand to end his life. The assassin, in this case, was the lead absorbed by the very delicacy the Marquis so enjoyed. Prefect Dubonnet looked around the room, his gaze settling finally on Madame Montpensier. "Madame," he said, his voice thick with regret, "this revelation fundamentally alters everything. Given Monsieur Holmes's findings and the corroborating reanalysis, the charges against you are immediately dropped. You are a free woman, completely exonerated." Tears streamed down Madame Montpensier's face, tears of profound relief and exhaustion. Her lawyer immediately went to her side, offering words of comfort and support. "But the arsenic, Monsieur Holmes?" Inspector Renaud ventured, breaking the emotional silence. "The phial in her jewellery box? If she did not poison him, how did it arrive there?" Holmes turned slowly, his piercing grey eyes locking directly onto the trembling figure of the valet. "Ah, yes, the arsenic. A clumsy, desperate flourish intended to guarantee a conviction." Monsieur Dubois shrank back in his chair, his face entirely bloodless. "You see, Inspector," Holmes continued, his voice taking on a sharper edge, "Madame Montpensier maintained her innocence regarding the vial, and she was telling the truth. The Marquis was a tyrannical man, deeply despised by his wife, yet worshipped by a few loyal retainers who blinded themselves to his faults. When the Marquis collapsed in agony shortly after a bitter, highly public argument with his wife, someone in this household jumped to a terribly flawed conclusion." Holmes took a slow step toward the valet. "Someone assumed Madame had finally taken her revenge, someone who idolized the Marquis and despised the Marquise. This person, discovering the Marquis dying and believing it to be murder, decided to ensure the guilty party would not escape justice. They retrieved an old phial of rodenticide from the garden sheds and clumsily planted it in Madame's boudoir amidst the chaos of the physician's arrival." The valet let out a strangled sob, burying his face in his hands. "She hated him," he wailed, his voice cracking. "I heard them screaming before dinner, when he fell, when he writhed in pain. I knew she had done it. I just wanted justice for my master." "Justice," Holmes said softly, his eyes reflecting a mixture of sternness and pity, "is rarely served by manufacturing evidence, Dubois. You nearly sent an innocent woman to the guillotine for a crime that never even occurred." The room was silent, save for the valet's wretched weeping. The final piece of the puzzle had slotted perfectly into place. The mystery of Bellechasse was, at last, entirely resolved. A return to Baker Street. The journey back to London was undertaken in a far different spirit than our arrival. The solemnity of the initial mission had been replaced by a quiet satisfaction, especially for me, as I reflected upon the sheer brilliance of my friend's deductions. Prefect Dubonnet, a man deeply relieved to have averted a grave miscarriage of justice, had been effusive in his gratitude, offering Holmes the highest commendations and a generous fee, which Holmes accepted with his usual indifference to monetary reward. As the train rattled through the English countryside, now bathed in the lingering twilight of the approaching summer, I found myself gazing out the window, processing the extraordinary events of the past few days. "It was a truly singular case, Holmes," I remarked, breaking the comfortable silence between us. "To think a common household item, an ancient larder, could become the instrument of death. Your unerring focus on the truffles, when all others were swayed by the obvious planted evidence of arsenic, was masterly." Holmes, who had been engrossed in a scientific journal, lowered it to his lap, a wisp of smoke curling from his pipe. "The obvious, my dear Watson, is frequently the most treacherous path. Human nature dictates a preference for the dramatic and the conspiratorial. A jealous wife, a hidden file, a potent poison. It forms a compelling narrative, easily digestible by the public and by less discerning investigators. Reality, alas, is often far more prosaic and far more insidious." "The simplicity of it," I exclaimed, "that a fungus absorbing lead could perfectly mimic a common poison. It speaks to a profound understanding of chemistry and physiology that few possess." "Indeed," Holmes assented, a faint smile playing on his lips. "The earth, Watson, holds many secrets, both benign and deadly. The truffles, those subterranean treasures, are merely conduits, drawing from their surroundings. Had the Marquis possessed a less refined palate, or had his chef stored his delicacies in a more modern manner, the tragedy might never have occurred. It was a perfect storm of unfortunate circumstances, compounded by a servant's misplaced, dangerous loyalty." "And Madame Montpensier?" I mused. "Her relief must have been immeasurable." "A woman snatched from the precipice of ruin, Watson," Holmes affirmed. "Such is the true reward of our endeavours, far more gratifying than the plaudits of officialdom or the pronouncements of the press. To right a wrong, to unravel the Gordian knot of injustice, that is the ultimate satisfaction." I nodded, feeling a surge of pride in my extraordinary friend. He had ventured into a foreign land, confronted a seemingly unassailable case, and, with the sheer force of his intellect and powers of observation, had peeled back the layers of misdirection to reveal the simple, profound truth. He had seen the invisible assassin lurking in the shadows of an ancient larder, exposed a dangerous frame-up, and saved a woman from a fate she did not deserve. As the train pulled into Charing Cross and the familiar gas lamps of London began to twinkle in the warm May dusk, I reflected upon the case of Madame Montpensier. It stands as a testament to the often hidden dangers of the mundane and a tribute to the unparalleled sagacity of Sherlock Holmes. It was another entry in the long and varied chronicle of his triumphs, a story that, though set far from the fog-shrouded streets of our homeland, illuminated with equal brilliance the singular genius of the man. As we stepped out into the bustling station, I knew that another such challenge would inevitably present itself, and Holmes would once again be ready to confront the intricate tapestry of human folly and fate. Thanks for joining me for another original mystery. Do not forget to check out our Patreon down below to support the channel.